special issue of Irish University Review with that title, Irish Studies Beyond the Text, guest edited by Professor Emily Mark-FitzGerald, who's not able to join us because she has flu, from UCD, and by Emma Radley, Dr. Emma Radley, who is here. We're delighted to welcome Emma. Emma is Senior Teaching and Research Fellow in the Department of English, Drama and Film, specialising in English film at UCD. We're joined also by Dr. Daithí Kearney, who's one of the contributors to the volume, the Irish University Review volume. And Daithí is a lecturer in music theatre and tourism studies at Dundalk Institute of Technology. So we especially welcome you as a new member of the Queen's family, soon to be. And we're looking forward to potential collaborations and synergies between this institution and Dundalk in the years to come. So I think Emma's going to start by giving us an introduction to the volume and to the themes of Irish Studies Beyond the Text, and then Daithí's going to do a presentation based on his contribution. So Emma, I'm going to pass over to you.
Great, thanks. Hi. I'm really happy to be here talking about this special issue. We're really proud of it. Sorry, Emily can't be here with us, but she has helpfully sent me on the material that she had prepared, so I'm going to read that as well. And I've tried to match my slides to the cover of the special issue, but I did turn out a little bit more lurid green than I had imagined. But anyway, hopefully it's legible. And I wanted to have our cover image here, Sean Hillen searching for evidence of patrol demolition in Father McDiar's folk village, which I think is a really kind of evocative image and kind of captures really the ethos and the spirit of what we were trying to do in the special issue, and very provocative as well, I think. So what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about where the genesis, I suppose, of this special issue, and give an overview of the ethos and what we were trying to achieve with it, and then go through the contributor list just to kind of give you a sense of, or flavour, I suppose, of the essays, and then hand over to Daithí's going to give us a practical example of our disruptive methodological approaches in the journal. So in the special issue. So this special issue, I suppose, kind of the idea for it started way back in 2020 with the publication of the Golden Jubilee issue of the Irish University Review, which is marking 50 years of the journal. The Irish University Review was founded in 1970 in the UCD Department of English, as was known then. Now it's the UCD School of English, Drama and Film. So it was founded by Maurice Harman. And the Golden Jubilee special issue, which was, I think, appositely titled Criticism, Openness, Diversity, Irish Studies Now, positioned itself very explicitly as an intervention into the field of Irish studies. So it was foregrounding a multidisciplinary and intersectional approach to the field of Irish studies, to challenge, I suppose, a perceived homogeneity in the field, specifically in this special issue around race, gender, sexuality and class. And it did do that. It was very dynamic, very important special issue. However, in the introduction, and I suppose specifically speaking to the openness and diversity aspects of the special issue title, Emily Pine, the editor, remarks on the necessarily limited, I suppose, nature of any such intervention. That while, and I'm quoting Pine here, Irish Studies has no founding charter, no list of commandments or global constitution. A volume of this kind emerges from the interests of individuals and groups, and it will always reflect the times in terms of what it includes and also what it excludes. Okay, so mapping a terrain inevitably involves borders, boundaries, edges. And I think in the case of the Golden Jubilee issue, while the content of the essays was indeed very critical, open and diverse, the methodological approaches that were foregrounded were perhaps less so. And I suppose, and I don't mean this as a criticism of the special issue, it was really important and really timely. But out of 14 full-length essays in this Jubilee issue, leaving aside the survey pieces on 50 years of the IUR and the various kind of mini essays on international, like the state of Irish studies and international Irish studies centres. So out of 14 full-length essays, 9 were effectively literary criticism. Okay, so covering poetry, drama, literature, and then there was a further 2 on using digital humanities and archives for developing literary research. So yeah, like when it, you know, it's not necessarily surprising, I suppose, in itself. The IUR is known primarily as, and indeed kind of originally founded as, the journal of record, I suppose, for Irish literary criticism. And it's, you know, associated with ISIL, which is the International Association of Irish Literature. That bears that out. But I think over the last few decades, it was clear that the boundaries of literary criticism were becoming a little stretched, becoming a little bit more mutable, I suppose, pushing out towards a broader cultural studies approach, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. So the work of scholars like Geraldine Meany, Elizabeth Butler-Cullingford, Joe Valenti, Margot Bacchus, Moyna Sullivan, and so on, all of whom kind of move very fluidly between film, literature, visual culture in their work. And they've become quite foundational, I suppose, in the field. And even, you know, the UCD School of English, in which the IUR kind of makes its spiritual home, is now the UCD School of English Drama and Film and Creative Writing as well. And the IUR was really kind of keen, I suppose, to reflect that shifting methodological terrain in future issues post-Jubilee issue, and to kind of really position itself not just as a journal of Irish literary studies, but more of an interdisciplinary Irish studies journal to attract a broader range of submissions, of readers, and reach in general. And Emily Pine, who was the editor of this special issue, but also general editor at the time, and then Lucy Collins, who was the associate editor, and now the general editor of the IUR, approached me to come on board as associate editor in 2022, primarily because my research, which is primarily in Irish film studies, but is, I think, very interdisciplinary in ethos. Like, I work across film, visual culture, literature, sometimes even archives, digital humanities as well. So one of the perks of coming on board as associate editor is that you get to commission a special issue based on your kind of main area of interest. And so the idea was that this special issue would kind of hard launch the IUR as a journal that was open to non-literary methodologies. And so this was really the beginning of the special issue, and obviously Emily was the obvious choice to approach with the proposition of co-editing this special issue, as her work on Irish art and visual culture is really so influential to me, but I think on the field in general. And I'd also always been struck by her really insightful comments on methodology, and particularly on methodological precision, as in the need to have an awareness of and a fluency in specialized methodologies in critical work. And a kind of a resistance to the tendency to flatten all cultural production to the status of the text, to be kind of recuperated for hermeneutic, I suppose, inquiry. So when it came to the special issue, then our conversations kind of developed towards wanting to position it not only within the micro frame of the IUR, of the Irish University Review, but also to think about it in terms of the macro field, right, of Irish studies itself, and to consider the kind of methodologies, or to have enter into dialogue, I suppose, with the kind of methodologies that are dominant in or dominate the field. And we started with that Jubilee issue, which kind of comes out in 2020, like in a period of renewed and intensified interest, I think, in field defining in Irish studies over the last 5 years or so. But I think it's helpful to cite something maybe more recent to crystallize the questions that we wanted to consider, however loosely, in this special issue. So in June 2024, a conference on the future of Irish studies in this university, in this very space, I think, also centered on the kind of pragmatic and intellectual challenges facing a field with, you know, rapidly diminishing resources and an indeterminate constituency, asking the question, you know, what even is Irish studies? Is it a discipline, a subfield, an anachronism, or simply a convenient portmanteau into which various disciplines interested in the island and its people are placed? And I think this is one of the questions that's really animated the field of Irish studies more broadly, at least Irish studies with a capital I and a capital S, right? In a particularly intense way, I think, in the last 5 years or so. But during this period, a number of collections, special issues, handbooks, critical companions, as well as many events and symposia have emerged, kind of focusing on the ways in which we define and map the field as we move into the 21st century. I suppose seeking in many ways to account for the states of Irish studies, right, after the Celtic Tiger. So these include the Jubilee issue of the IUR, edited by Emily Klein, but also Paige Reynolds' The New Irish Studies from 2021, Eamon Marr and Eugene O'Brien's Reimagining Irish Studies for the 21st Century, and then I think most comprehensively, the Routledge International Handbook of Irish Studies, which was edited by Renee Fox, Mike Cronin, and Brian O'Crohor. And I had quite a personal stake in this because I contributed to 2 of those volumes myself. So yeah, I was kind of really enmeshed, I suppose, in these questions as well. And many of these interventions, I think, are underpinned by an ethos of multi or interdisciplinarity, and really a commitment to diversifying the disciplines, methodologies, and ideologies conventionally associated with Irish studies. And this is often framed, I think, as a revitalization or a renewal, right, of the field, an opening up of the field beyond the historically dominant disciplines of literature and history in particular, but also beyond kind of post-colonial approaches to questions of the nation and the long dominance of post-colonial cultural criticism in a broader sense in Irish studies. You can see that hopefully with the green background in these quotations here from the Routledge International Handbook of Irish Studies as well. So talking this from the introduction, that the volume spans the humanities and social sciences in order to develop continuities and enable conversations across disciplines that often move in different orbits. That it's about, you know, developing the field and, most importantly, questioning our own habits, assumptions, and normalizing scholarly practices as well. And this is, you know, vitally important work, absolutely, but it is nevertheless, I think, tentative and complex and uncertain. So even as a lot of these collections work very hard to unsettle the disciplinary norms of Irish studies, many of them achieve it unevenly, and I mean necessarily, you know, it is a limited intervention by default, I suppose, but particularly, I think, to only tentatively challenge the continued dominance of the fields of Irish literary studies and Irish histories in Irish studies. And as scholars from both me and Emily, scholars from outside these core disciplines, our attention in this special issue particularly is focused on arguably, I think, one of the most excluded interrogations within Irish studies, and that is the centrality of the text itself, okay, and the practice of textual analysis. And this is understood in the narrow sense of analysis of the written word in particular, okay, as a foundational principle, as a foundational approach, as a foundational methodology, effectively. So close readings of canonical and non-canonical literary works inflected with a range of theoretical positions really continue to dominate Irish studies publications and conferences that are, you know, purport to represent the field at large. Within Irish historical practice, reification of textual archives has only recently been tempered with alternative, dematerialized or non-empirical approaches, heightened attention to oral history, for example, but also autoethnography as well. And so I suppose what we wanted to think about was the way in which centering other ways of knowing, other ways of encountering production, be that embodied, affectual, sensorial, and so on, can really disrupt textually focused forms of inquiry and cultural production and establish, I suppose, creative practice in particular as, you know, not just objects of critical discourse, but kind of productive, I suppose, in terms of methodology. So as I think Kelly Sullivan notes here, and here she's talking about looking specifically at material objects, okay, rather than texts, that attention to the object complicates and broadens the narrative we tell about Irish and diasporic cultural history post-Tiger. It helps to unsettle our assumptions about Irish culture and practice. And one thing we did want to be careful with in our special issue was how we framed that, okay? We didn't want to present the special issue as a kind of a, like to reinscribe that discourse of opening up the field, revitalizing or reinvigorating the field of Irish studies with these, with the injection of these cool new methodologies or radical methodologies. This would still, I think, privilege the center, right? That the position of these disciplines or these methodologies as a supplement to or an addition to a main field. And like such work or such methodologies are not new in that, like Irish studies in theatre, music, art, visual, material culture, design, folklore, anthropology, and so on, have long prioritized and advanced knowledge in different ways about how Irish culture is seen, heard, felt, performed, and experienced. Okay, so we did want to kind of frame this as in like we were focusing on this in and of itself, as opposed to as a supplement to, a dominant field. And so we started instead with an invitation, with an openness, taking inspiration from this comment by anthropologist Elizabeth Edwards in her recent Photographs and the Practice of History from 2021, where she argues for photographs to be looked at not as texts to be studied, but as disturbances, as think spaces that confront assumptions underpinning historical practice. She recalls how the philosopher of history, Elko Runia, excuse my pronunciation if that's not correct, has called this creating a mess. Okay, in that thinking theoretically about what we are doing is not merely a body of concepts, but the process of quarreling with the tools of the trade. And that final quotation is really what drove us, I suppose, in our call for papers, and then ultimately putting together this special issue. We were really interested in how this might transpose onto the field of Irish studies, which, as we know, is not a single discipline per se, but carries with it many assumptions of common methodologies, disciplinary forms of training and approaches. And we were really interested in how alternative methodologies, ones that don't foreground the written text as a central object of inquiry, might unsettle norms within Irish studies. And so we invited contributors in our call for papers to make a mess of the boundaries of Irish studies, seeking new work and new perspectives that explicitly go beyond the text. And in doing so, I think this issue features not only contributions making very innovative use of non-textual sources and methodologies, but also research on cultural practices which themselves disrupt assumptions about the nation and epistemologies of Irishness that underpin the field. We've also welcomed authors that are, writing from a range of geographical locations and scholarly or intellectual positions. And so in this special issue, we're really presenting our own mapping, tentative mapping, I suppose, of an Irish studies that embraces contact across difference, okay, as a means of creating new things. And that's a quotation from one of our contributors' essays. In selecting these essays, we really sought to bring, we really sought new work, I suppose, that engages with varying forms of intimacy and scale, with relationality and boundaries, and with vibrant and evolving terrains of cultural practice. And so this is our table of contents, and it's quite small here. But I'm just going to give a very brief overview of each of these essays before handing over to Daithí, just so you can see how the contributors approach these questions. So the contents of the journal are divided across 3 sections. So there's body and I and voice. So again, we're kind of privileging or foregrounding non-textual work here. So the first section, body, foregrounds work on performance, embodiment, and immersive theatre, at the heart of which is a consideration of how bodies themselves, both the performance and the audience, contribute to meaning making and operate as personal and collective archives of knowledge and experience and memory. So Daithí Kearney's essay, on which you're going to hear more shortly, is the first of a trio of essays focused on dance and performance. Here he performs an autodidactic examination of dance traditions from North Kerry, integrating video recording and ethno-choreology to foreground movement as a form of embodied and inherited knowledge. And we'll let Daithí tell you more about his essay in a minute. And then we have Wei Zhang's essay here, which performs a close analysis of choreography and performance in Pushkane's Dance Theatre's palimpsest. There's a real focus here on embodiment, and particularly how the performance itself works to defigure Irish history, so particularly women's suffrage, post-2008 recession and the peace process in particular. So in this essay, Yang uses the concept of defigurative choreography and corporeality to explore how the work unsettles truisms and forms of memory in particular. Javier Torres Fernandez does an analysis, or his essay is an analysis, this is Pop Baby's party scene, again focuses on performance and embodiment, and looks particularly at how immersive theatre practices in particular create a kind of an intimate engagement with the audience, and invites the audience to directly and effectively confront substance abuse in the LGBTQI community, and the stigmatization of queer sexual desire in a work that blends art and activism. And finally, Chloe Duan's essay on Druid theatre companies waiting for Godot focuses on site-specific performances in 3 remote locations, so Inishmaan, the Aran Islands, and County Wicklow. Her specific methodology is performance analysis, okay, with a particular focus on scenographic design. And she also embeds her own experience as an audience member in how that kind of, I suppose, your engagement with it. She examines modes of audience encounter and embodied responses to place and scenography. Our second section, I, brings together work on visual art, activism, collectivity. So Anne Curran, first of all, she introduces the work of Francois Sullivan, recently reappraised Quebec conceptual artist from Quebec, okay. In particular, her 1970s performance works on the Blasket Islands, and she's particularly, again, interested in how these works, and particularly their subsequent circulation and afterlives as images, film, and via exhibition, how the archival traces of live performance reinscribe their meaning for later audiences. And then Sarah Churchill's essay here, Domestic Documents, Contemporary Photography and the Irish Housing Crisis, from which our cover image comes, brings together multiple generations of photographers pre and post 2008 whose works have confronted different stages of housing economic crisis, focusing on how their domestic documents make visible the range of cultural values invested in what makes a home. Okay, and so there's a real interest here in the imagined conception of home and the complex reality of its lived experience. Molly Claire Gillett's essay, Only a Canvas Between You and the Sea, the currach in Irish feminist and eco-critical art practice, outlines the long history of the currach in Irish visual arts practice, threading a line from the watercraft as a symbol of Irish rural authenticity and masculinity in the early 20th century, including the work of Paul Henry and Singh here, to recent multimedia and performance work by Dorothy Cross and Susan Hughes, which situate the currach in new expressions of animal-human, gender, and power relations. Okay, so this essay really traces the materiality of the currach and its association with place and vernacular culture, in particular focusing on how contemporary artists have reconceived the currach to critique romantic nationalist myths, while also confronting contemporary environmental crisis as well. Kate Antisix Parsons' essay looks at the Belfast-based Array Collective's immersive installation, The Druid's Ball, from 2021, arguing here that immersive and interactive performance space, which is basically they created a shebeen in which you could encounter objects containing a collection of protest-oriented artworks in particular, operates as a kind of third space, which allows for a disruptive encounter with conventional understandings of art, Irishness, and nation. The final essay in this collection, or in this section here, Sorcha ní Bhraonáin, deploys the concept of the cloud, specifically the data cloud, as a means of exploring the multidisciplinary collective annex, their exhibition Entanglement. So effectively, this essay relates the pervasive and accelerating datafication of the Irish experience to its troubling socio-political and environmental consequences. Our final section, Voice, brings together new research based on orality, music, and trans or multimedia practices by 20th and 21st century Irish artists and activists who unsettle expectations of their art forms, command new audiences and narratives, and offer ripostes to fixed notions of Irishness. So it begins quite literally by exploring the lesser-known voice of canonical Irish writer Yeats. So looking at voice, his radio work, rather than his texts, his poems, or his plays. Ilaria Natalie dissects his broadcast for Radio Éireann and the BBC, and specifically the manner in which he experimented with orality and performance, with rhythm and recitation, to produce a kind of enchanting ritual for listeners. So really kind of challenging, I suppose, our understanding of Yeats in Irish cultural production. And then Christina Varad's essay brings together the often marginalized presence of traveller voices to the fore, in particular through the use of transmedia, so specifically theatre, television, podcasting, and social media posts as well by Owen de Vardoon, Martin Beans Ward, and Helena Loves Martin Ward. To confront stereotypes of their community and to construct more authentic narratives that traverse traditional storytelling and contemporary experiences of traveller life. So the essay explores how young travellers use transmedia and digital media, like TikTok, Facebook, podcasting, to kind of to challenge the kind of conventional way in which the traveller experience is represented in popular culture. And then Francisca Fernandez Arce's exploration of Northern Irish musician, writer, and poet Ciarán Carson's, For All We Know, from 2008, focuses particularly on the tension between language and musical experience in his work, looking at how Carson's work allows for new or more intimate forms of self-recognition that are not predicated on linguistic representation. Instead, it is about musicality, okay? That the way in which the work through music and musicality foregrounds the embodied nature of both performing and time. And then finally, Jordan Fallon tracks the Celtic errantry of the Pogues, focusing particularly on Glissan's concept of the archipelagic, okay, to delineate how the band's lyrics, music, and performances hybridize tradition and disruption, alternately joyful, scathing, and emancipating, arguing that their music offers, through a hybridization of traditional Irish music practices and punk sensibility, it offers a sense of non-fixed and multiplicitous Celtic identity, which opens up a connection with the world. So that's our special issue. I'm really delighted now to turn the floor over to Daithí Kearney, who's the author of the first essay in our volume, and which is currently open access. So you can all go and read this yourselves. So he's going to share with you details of his contribution, Watch the Feet, Understanding Irish Dance Traditions as an Embodied Archive, and really make manifest for you, I think, the methodologies of knowing and making that runs through our collection.
Hopefully, yeah. In presenting my mess, I'm going to present a particular challenge to the camera, because I'm going to come on to this space here. I might ask you.
Yeah, I will end this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I suppose the opening of my talk here is inspired a little bit by very recent experiences that come after the article, but remind me that this is ongoing, because When my son was 4 years old, he started Irish dancing. And the dancing teacher, her pedagogical approach, I suppose, was a bit old school, and it was about bodily control. So she, you know, made him hands in, cross the feet, point the toes, jump. 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. He could do it. She knows his steps, she'd tell me, but he could do it a bit of practice at home. No, Dad, she says I know it. I don't want to practice. For me, he's seen me dance a few times, but not often. So sometimes I try to help him. I encourage him to get up on his toes, to cross his feet, to jump in the air, up high, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. But for me, the best moments are when he's standing to one side, his hands in his pocket, and I'm playing a CD in the kitchen, and he just starts. 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. They tell me he dances like his father. He's never seen me dance like that. He's seen me stand, and he's seen me walk. He's seen me gesture. So my observations of my son contextualize and add to my reflections on my own practice, my engagement with my own practice, and the dances that I've encountered through audiovisual archives, in particular older dancers.
Yeah.
Brilliant. In challenging the methodologies, I write, you dance unimpeded by instruction, carving your own space between the rocks, continuing while watching the straightened canals, needing no horse to tow your load. I shout to give direction, all to your course in the landscape. You flood, and as the waters recede, journey to the sea in blissful oblivion. I watch your gentle flow, admiring how your current carries you forward, as natural as one foot after the other, an instinctive embodiment of contentment. I'm interested in how our bodies communicate aspects of our culture. I'm interested in learned behaviors that become exaggerated in the dance. As Yeats asked, how can we know the dancer from the dance? A quote that also precedes Yang's article subsequently in the journal. Even if my son has rarely seen me dance, he sees me stand and walk as I am. After class last Friday, we stopped for a message in town. Between the shop and the car, he started dancing. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. See, Dad, I can kick my bum. His natural movement is now shaped by new experiences, aesthetics, and instruction. His body encapsulates the present, and our bodies are living archives. I too can learn from him. There's a genealogy in the dance. I can trace it backwards. As a child, I grew up in North Kerry, where I was fortunate to join the training centre of Shím Satira, the National Folk Theatre of Ireland. And I learned dancing there and performed with them for well over a decade, various dance forms, but rooted in a local dance tradition. My teacher was Patricia Hannafin. Patricia was one of the first dancing teachers to be registered in North Kerry. We often think of Kerry as a place where there's great traditions, and yet much of it existed outside of formalization or institutionalization. We didn't need to be part of the big institutions, it was there. The institutions were needed where it was not. But Patricia couldn't enter her students in competitions. You had to be registered, and therefore she had to go and do exams, receive instruction. She had learned from older dancers. Patricia was very much influenced by Father Pat Ahern, still alive, a good friend of mine. And Pat Ahern had recognized in the 1970s that the dance traditions locally were dying out. They were under threat. And he arranged for some audiovisual archiving of these dances. But he was coming at it as somebody who knew the dance, as somebody who had learned it himself. And he had learned it from the previous generation. And the dancing master Jeremiah Molyneux, often referred to as Jerry Munnix, a blacksmith's son in North Kerry. Munnix would have travelled around much of North Kerry, staying in various houses from time to time and teaching his dance for a number of weeks, having a night at the end where the money would have been raised, and then he would move on again. It was competitive, but not in the feis context. It was competitive in that this was his livelihood. And his livelihood was embodied in the way that he danced, in the way that his feet gestured. He's remembered today with this lovely statue at his grave, the dancing shoes. And these shoes reflect how his tradition has been passed on and comes forward. That sense of passing it on, we can consider that examining the practice of Irish dancing is not solely an engagement with history, but rather provides an alternative perspective on the present that questions the transgenerational stability of knowledge. When my son kicked his bum last Friday, that's a challenge to that transgenerational stability of knowledge, and how he's moving away from the Munich style. There was a recognition in the 70s that when these steps are no longer passed on and performed, an understanding of local distinctiveness and a sense of place can be lost. And this isn't radical, because it very much reflects people like Apagera's modernity at large. These dancers, reflected here with Jerry Nolan and Liam Tarrant, two men I never met, become part of my embodied experience. And like ethnography in general, my dancing is my archive of lived actualities. I seek out examples from the past, but I embody them in the present. And I seek out interpretations and performances that engage tradition and modernity, focusing on the solo dancer, but mindful of the community of practice associated with dance. These two images might seem a world apart. I'm sure some of you will recognize the rather blurred image on the bottom, the famous Chicago Irish dancer Michael Flatley. And yet this top image is from 1976, when these two men from North Kerry performed in the Palace Theatre in Broadway, New York, to a wide audience. Amongst Jerry, after flying home, got off the bus at the end of the road, walked up and got ready to milk the cows. I don't think Flatley does that today, and yet their artistry is similar. The level of commercialization and money and development, Flatley can certainly kick his bum. But for Jerry Nolan and Liam Tarrant, the embodiment was close to the floor. It was in the cottages and houses of North Kerry, where they danced what might be termed cultural containers. And Emma made reference to the Handbook of Irish Studies recently released, in which Maeve Urahan talks about a song or a tune, Misha Era, as a cultural container. For me, the blackbird is a cultural container. Jerry Nolan in his cottage might have had a very good floor, so he may have taken the door from its hinges to create a platform, and he might have danced the blackbird like this. He didn't need the big Broadway stage to entertain. And yet in his movement, it's like writing on the floor with his feet. Each movement becomes an inscription, an alternative text that we can read. As Barbara O'Connor says in the Irish dancing individuals not only experience culture, but they also actively produce it. The blackbird is still danced today. And Catherine Foley has recently written an article about those steps, which have been accepted into competitions, the type of competitions that Patricia Hannifin had to register to enter her students in. But in her article, she gathers some feedback from teachers, where they comment that the style is not taken seriously, because the limitations of space in the cottage meant that the artistry had to be in a small space. It was the nature of the kitchen. Now on the big stage, they're dancing in a very technical way. You have to spend time getting the style, says this anonymous contributor. Another Irish dancing teacher, Oren Ivrian, says, The champion dancers are unaware that the feis style is removed from the close to the floor style associated with the dancers in North Kerry. The overcrossing, verticality, and strict posture are features. Because whereas I can relax and dance as Jerry Nolan did, the dancers in the feis will have their hands strictly by their side, their feet overly crossed. And when they come to bring their leg to the bang, it'll come sharp to the hip. And jump. I'd nearly tear a hamstring doing that. So the style, the understanding of our bodily movements are part of how we understand. In developing my article, I looked at web videos for competitive dancers, which are widely available on YouTube, to look at this aspect of posture and verticality, to see how style has changed, recognizing that the older dancers embodied modes of inquiry. And for me, obviously here in the centre, I had a particularly memorable occasion about 3 years ago when I danced with Patricia Hannafin, my teacher, and Jimmy Smith, another teacher locally, who was a huge influence on me. Michael Murphy, who was the original dancer of the Seville Suite, the precursor of Riverdance, Sharon Phelan, another dance scholar, and Catherine, my mind has gone blank for a minute, but I was thinking about Catherine here, who was another student of Patricia's at the honorary doctorate celebrations for Father Pat Ahern at University College Cork. And in looking at this image, I actually see other aspects of the archival footage that I looked at. If you look at, in particular in this instance, Michael, Jimmy, and myself, we were holding hands. In an age when that may not be seen as a masculine activity, when we look at the dancers from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they are holding hands. Big, tough men, farmers, got up to dance lightly on their feet. What's very interesting, and this week there's a production on the road with Idina Gucci and the Devil in the Dance Hall, which draws on that idea that the priests banned dancing or gave out about the dancing, and yet there's a priest sitting down just off camera here, being honoured for his contribution to preserving the dance and challenging some of the narratives. Here we are dancing the Blackbird, and you can see our feet ready to do that twist. These localized gestures that capture part of the community. We're not exhausted and out of breath. We're not challenged by age, even though it's becoming increasingly problematic. We become living archives that reinterpret all the time. As Aoife McGrath of this institution says, the dance, we need to understand the communicative capabilities of socio-political and socio-political agency of dancing bodies. And that comes through a number of the essays in the opening section of this. This is an intergenerational activity more than perhaps a sport, as Flatley and others might have presented it. But for me also, it's important to understand it, to know where we come from and to understand it. In the image that Emma pointed up beside my article in her introduction, there's an image of Father Pat Ahern leaning over watching me dance at the launch of his book last year. And in the video of it, somebody comes to speak to him while I'm dancing, and he interrupts and says, "Watch the feet," which I suppose inspires my article in this journal. In another article I wrote about Jerry Nolan, who died before I was 2 years of age, and I commented that although I didn't know him, I know his dance. In this instance, inspired by me watching the videos of these dancers, I wrote, "They stood straight, the dancers, hands by side like soldiers, or holding hands in kinship. Masculinity in every step, yet feminine caring in the whole embodiment of tradition. The soul that they expressed in movement with absolute commitment. It's not enough to watch the feet, but even feet betray paths cut through time to the old half door laid out on the kitchen floor. Surrounded by wise eyes who understood without need to analyze, wondrous writings, ephemeral yet joyously unforgettable. Maintained by muscle memory, artful archives, a treasury of metadata, without which interpretation is unrich. Unintelligible accents create sound and movements to generate neither carbon copy nor an effective imitation. As I walk in step, I soldier, becoming a beholder, embodying inheritance in my dance and stance, stretching, moving, learning. I must grow to further meaning, relax in the rhythm and rhyme of footsteps from another time. I leave you today with that thought that to understand society and culture, we can look to our bodies. Thank you very much.
That's absolutely marvelous. Thank you both so much. This is a first for our studies here at Queen's, having the door on the floor and anyone dancing on it. So that's absolutely fantastic. Both have great presentations. We can take questions either to Daithí on his presentation or to Emma on the kind of really important, significant themes raised by the special issue Irish University Review as a whole. People online that want to ask a question, either type a question into the box or raise your hand digitally, and Beck will let us know you're waiting to ask. So that's who'd like to get us started. It is.
I'm fascinating the whole way through, and as Peter says, definitely at first. And I mean, I'm asking a question which might appear slightly brought up, but it's not.
That's okay.
I suspect this is in part of the editorial debates the levity issue. I mean, is this completely random text, or is it talking about new kinds of text?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what we did want to specify the written text, as in like literature and kind of the historical text primarily, because we did want to resist that urge to kind of flatten everything into a text where everything becomes recuperable as a text, like as a text that can be read, that is subject to a hermeneutic inquiry, you know, that that everything in cultural studies kind of is open to being read as a text. And so that is why we specified that when we say beyond the text, we specifically mean beyond the literary text, beyond, you know, that, like, specifically, I suppose, Irish literary studies and history particularly. But I understand that the impulse, I suppose, to kind of to read textually.
Yeah, and I'll follow, because there was two specific things in my articular presentation here, in the sense of I returned to text at the end, of course, by writing a poem. So, you know, there's a circularity, but I think, as Emma said in the introduction, it's not about abandoning everything.
Yeah.
It's about augmenting.
Yeah.
And then the second part of the question, are we just looking at a different type of text? There are some that would argue that maybe the ephemerality of the dance challenges it to be considered as a text. So yes, I am reading the body. I'm observing the gestures and the movements of other dancers, be it through archival or, as I did for today, my own son. But is it a text? I think is a more challenging question. And I think there's a number out there, particularly in dance scholarship, that would say, no, that is not a text. It is something different.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. It's really rich, both the elements. I just wanted to pick up on the first part of this. So you mentioned this conference last year, the Future of Irish Studies conference last year. And I remember at that conference, one of the big parts of that was this focus on infrastructures. So this idea that, you know, the infrastructure of Irish studies is so often centred around literary studies and whatnot. So that seems to be a big part of the problem, if you like, of like this push to move beyond that. So I wonder if you could connect that with what happens beyond this special issue. Is there more infrastructure that's going to happen beyond this? Are you going to put on more special issues? We're going to be a special issue that takes place beyond the text every couple of years or something, so that you can help develop this, push it forward? Or is it going to be a stance? No, it would be a
I suppose. I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to say. I mean, I can speak, I suppose, to the kind of impulse towards this particular special issue was initially to diversify the IUR effectively, which was to kind of make it a journal that was more interdisciplinary, I suppose. And really, I mean, since the publication of this special issue, we have noticed an uptick in submissions, like non-literary submissions. And in fact, we now have an associate editorship which is primarily focused on visual culture and non-literary submissions. So the idea is that the IUR specifically will continue to kind of advocate for, you know, more non-literary methodologies to be published and to be present within the journal. In terms of like Irish studies more broadly, so where I'm coming from is primarily, you know, from I come, like, Irish film studies is my area, and it's kind of like, where do you find yourself, like, within that? Where do you find yourself? And often I would find myself at, say, ISOL, for example, the International Association for Studies in Irish Literature, as, you know, the film person on one panel, etc. So, I mean, it is difficult, I think. And the idea with this is to try to kind of imbricate these less textual, because they are less literary, I suppose, methodologies, and kind of make them more present within Irish studies as a whole. Whether the money will follow that, I don't know. Yeah. So.
I think there's an interesting, again, the interdisciplinary aspect of Irish studies. When we see what happens at different conferences, we talk about IASL there, but I remember the Irish Studies Conference in Derry a few years ago, and there's a greater effort to integrate music, for example. I'm coming at this primarily as an ethnomusicologist and a cardiologist. And I'm seeing a greater uptake, for example, the ICTMD conferences, where you have performance practice papers as opposed to read papers. But that requires support. We're also seeing the growth of creative practice, PhD research and things like that. But not necessarily within the Irish studies space, but it doesn't mean that Irish studies can't also be part of that space. So we're seeing, I think, the overlaps, being able to look out. That's the great strength of Irish studies, is that it does look across disciplines and borrow from things like that. If I make reference to another publication during the summer, Lauren Cassidy's Queer Era, so Lauren, who's between Dublin and here, that was an interesting offering as well, which the call for papers challenged contributors to consider the representation of Ireland, but again, in a number of ways, primarily creative. So I actually did contribute a song in that instance. And again, it was a challenge for Lauren to consider how these things can be represented, not in this, but on a website. And again, the song was a challenge.
And that, even in terms of publication, this special issue particularly, that was actually something that we explored. It's like, you know, that we're talking quite a lot about performative or embodied or corporeal kind of methodologies, but how do we capture those in terms of production as well, like publication? And even like it just wasn't the infrastructure. In fact, like, this is published by EUP, Edinburgh University Press, and there just wasn't a way to have, for example, an online archive of, you know, performances and so on, which is a pity, because I think that, you know, that would have really enriched. It would have moved, yes, the special issue beyond the text as well. But I think that's also something that I think, we do need to.
We do, and again, to give Peter credit as well, the idea of a seminar like this, where I'm physically here dancing, is a totally different experience. Even if we did a seminar online, I mean, you can watch a video of me, but actually that defeats the purpose of some of the things I'm saying, to actually be physically present and experience. And that goes across theatre studies, dance studies, music. It's a different thing to be present.
Yes, Sean.
You've been talking about expanding the definition of what is the subject matter of Irish studies, but that has implications for our actual definition of Irish. If you're talking about literature, it's straightforward enough. It's people writing in Ireland for Irish audiences. If you talk about history, it's very straightforward. It's things that happen. But when you come to material culture, I mean, for example, for every person who goes to performance of Irish dancing, there are probably a dozen going to hear Taylor Swift or Ariana Grande. So if your focus is going to be on bits of material culture, distinct from Ireland, I'm not going to that for a very sectional vision or a very sectional part of our society.
Yeah, yes and no. I even think back, to take Riverdance, for example. If we think of who the original two dancers there, Jean Butler and Michael Flatley, New York and Chicago, very much an Irish diaspora. So, I mean, there's a global element there. If we went to see Riverdance this summer in the Gaiety, Haley Richardson from America was the fiddle player. But beyond that, there was dancers from different parts of the world within the Riverdance troupe doing Irish dancing, or maybe more appropriately termed river dancing. That's become a global expression too, or a global participative culture that's not located here. It has its origins here, and maybe some of what I'm doing is tracing some of those journeys backwards. Again, some of the contemporaries of Munich would have gone to America, and we can see how they taught the people who taught Jean Butler. So there's a genealogy within that. But when I speak in other ways about Síl Satira, for example, which would have been, it's no longer, but it was National Folk Theatre of Ireland, when they were developing their dance practice in the 90s in particular, but from 1985 to the 2000s, they were working with Bulgarian dancers, they were working with Spanish flamenco dancers, they were working, so it was still Irish arts, but it was bringing in lots of different influences. So again, it wasn't still the kitchen in North Kerry, but the kitchen in North Kerry was part of a more global expression, and Irish studies can embrace that global expression of what it is.
Yeah, but the materially based Ireland is not going to cover the people who follow Manchester United and go to hear Taylor Swift. It's going to be people who go to hear Irish dances, or to see a specific performance by Druid or whatever.
Potentially, but so I wrote about something like this as well previously in relation to the pub session, and I commented on how sitting in a pub in East Cork, I couldn't start the session until the Champions League game between Manchester United and Atletico Madrid had finished. And went to extra time, so the session was delayed. The people involved, they were following Manchester United, to use your example. And then we started into the session, and somebody wanted to sing a song, and it turned out to be a lad from Poland who came up to sing a typical, probably a song that Stephen has covered in his book, with a strong Polish accent, but absolutely emerged. So I think, again, the Irish studies needs to understand the complexities of Irish society, and as that changes too, and who becomes part of that Irish society. That was in East Cork, but as a musician, I've performed in very random places around the world. And again, in Brazil, I remember sitting in a session, and some of the local musicians, we played for about 20 minutes, half an hour, and one of them turns on, "Are we doing it right?" Yeah, but they'd never experienced Ireland, but they were performing an Irish traditional music session in Brazil. And that's always struck. Are we doing it right? What does right mean? It's are we doing it like they do it in Ireland or that? So again, I don't think it's I think it has to embrace these different realities.
Thank you very much. I appreciate both the transdisciplinary intervention, or whatever variety of terms we can use for it, as an interdisciplinary person. I like that. And I really love seeing dance as a dancer and choreographer myself, who also works in so many other fields that are textual. So I guess I just, like, two things popped into my head, so just like throwing them into the air. They're sort of questions, thoughts, just because I'm kind of move between these spaces, not necessarily always at the same time, but my own choreography for like 25 years always uses film, installation art. It always uses sound, it uses text, projects things, and often works a little bit with the inheritance of like someone like Meredith Monk. So thinking about like what's dance and what's not dance, right? Which is really kind of in the background of what you're talking about when we start to say, like, not to move into dance theory, but when we start to say, like, what's dance? Am I walking down the street? Like, if I'm looking at my son moving, is that a part of, is that something that we can talk about? Which, so like these conversations, and she's not the only one, she's just a prominent person thinking about the quotidian, or thinking about, movements into pushing past those boundaries, like wonderfully started like in the 60s and 70s, but it's interesting to think of them as an intervention on that level, moving into conversations with Irish studies. So that's like one kind of fun thing. So I really appreciated seeing you dance. So I guess my question is, thinking about that, so how could this intervention also think beyond just like methodology in this sense, right? Because one thing I think about when I, having just finished a degree in Irish Studies at BC, is like time, not only methodology in terms of material. And if we go back enough in time, I'm an early modernist, as well, you know, then we don't have film, which I love. We don't have video, we don't have Twitter. Even like when I was in college, we didn't have Twitter. Email was invented, right? So, which is kind of cool. And so like when we think of that, I guess I'm just kind of pushing back a little bit because I always think of that's just sort of my nature. I'm annoying that way. I always like to push back. So if we think we go back in time enough, right, like we would say, okay, text, right, text. But then people were moving across the island, right? What were they doing with their bodies, right? And how like the tendency to map was not an Irish thing. Right? It's just an early modern observation that the Irish didn't produce maps. Why? I work in place things too. So because space and text and bodies were like this, right? So there wasn't a separation, and not in some romanticized view. It just wasn't, right? We can't fully know what that experience was then because I can't go back to that period and ask like Akio Hozo, like what he felt while he was allowed to travel across the island, across like, you know, patron spaces as a learned member of, you know, as a member of the learning class when other people couldn't, like patrons of that class could, not patrons, learned members. So I guess I'm thinking like, one thing I noticed in Irish studies is a lack of interest or inclusion of other times before the 19th century, the 20th century. Sure. And to me, that's an inclusion that I noticed reproduced even. And when I think of methodology, I think of time and space because it's right there. If we go back in time, right, archaeology, objects, lithic spaces, buildings, all of these are forms of embodiment. So I'm wondering like how can we push that down even more to say like, what about for late and early modern Ireland before we had these forms? Yeah, they're doing the same thing in different ways, and it's more interesting to have both. Yeah, that's my.
That's cool. No, I listen. I hear what you're saying, and I agree. And in fact, that was part of our editorial conversation when we were writing the CFP. We were very hopeful when we put it out there that we would get material that was non-contemporary or at least pre-19th century, which you know is you know the kind of the line, I guess, from which Irish studies kind of right. Well, yeah, but we did hope, and it just didn't happen in terms of the submissions that we got, unfortunately. And we were hoping for, you know, work on archive. We were hoping for work perhaps on oral tradition in folklore and the transmission of culture through kind of non-textual means, but it just didn't materialize. Yeah,
I'm just throwing.
No, I know. I agree. Yeah, so but it's interesting to say like why didn't we in fact get submissions kind of based on those kinds of subject areas as well, you know? And so there are still questions, absolutely, I think. Yeah.
It seems like another level of inherently interesting conversation. Yeah. When I think of monk, for example, makes me think of that bridge between the quotidian, we think that's not dance, or that's not movement, or we don't, the way text can analyze, or text includes spatial. It's just already there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, questions on that?
Yeah, I was just hoping to clarify the name of the publication mentioned by Lauren Trask.
Oh, Queer Era, and it's available online. It's a website, an anthology of contemporary Irish writing, I think.
It is.
Yeah. And queer spelled Q-U-A-R-E.
Yeah.
Anything else online? Okay, great. So, so thank you both very much for this. There are real challenges for those of us who are involved in the kind of institutional end of Irish studies. There are challenges about genuinely creating interdisciplinary engagement in the way that you have so effectively described through this project today. How we carry that forward beyond, you know, a specific intervention like a journal of this sort. Each institution that does Irish studies has got a different bundle of specialisms, expertise, different conversations taking place within them. In Queen's, because of our specific history, we have more on the ethnographic side, we have more on the social scientific side than perhaps other institutions. We've maybe got less on the creative arts side, you know. Not least because we have a separate Seamus Heaney Centre for for creative writing. You wasn't pull much of the activity in that direction. I think one way in which we can, in a sense, kind of get beyond perhaps our specific institutional definitions of Irish studies is through engagement in large-scale conferences, which are genuinely interdisciplinary and are not simply about literature. Because it gives us an opportunity, I think, to kind of potentially broaden what we're doing within them. So, I mean, we hosted, for example, the European Ephesus European Irish Studies Conference here a few years ago. We did take people to see the Druids Ball that was in the installation that was in the Ulster Museum, got the artists to talk about that. That was something which we don't usually do in our own seminar series here, but that bigger event gave us the opportunity to kind of move outside and do something kind of more challenging in that way. So that might be one way of taking things forward, is kind of encouraging people to think about the big Irish Studies conferences and what exactly is being done in those to create these genuine conversations.
And I think, again, to challenge the notion of a conference and what a conference is in terms of paper sessions, that conferences can include film screenings, they can include dance performances, music performances, and those are sometimes the spaces in which people come to those realizations. So we do have our institute. Every institution has those divisions between disciplines or between across campuses, and the space to have the conversation can be challenging. But I was attracted by it from the call for papers for this, in that invitation, you know, and I think that invitation can be reiterated and reinforced, and maybe bring in some of those areas that are not present. But within our conferences, that actually are that the time is given over to something that's not the 20-minute conventional paper.
To kind of structure it in a different way as well, right? So that those kind of film screenings or performances aren't add-ons or supplements to the proper business of like academic conferencing, but it is actually, as you say, an alternative space in which to engage or to engage differently. Yeah.
I just following in what you were saying, I was thinking as you were talking through this really impressive table of contents, how skeptical I was about, if you were in the UK system, the output, while now they're talking about non-traditional output, so a performance and a dance, a song, whatever. If you work in the creative industry, a digital output or something heritage related, they are saying that stuff is going to be readable. But who's going to be reviewing it, and what kind of grades are they going to be assigning? And that's what I was thinking as you were speaking, that in a way it's great that in the Republic of Ireland you don't worry about those things so much necessarily, at least in ref terms, but in the UK that is a factor.
I might bring an example from America. So recently I was in conversation with Professor Scott Spencer from California, whose work has involved development of digital humanities and online stuff, and he, in developing some of those projects, built in a peer review aspect. So kind of cognizant of the question coming after, he tried to preempt. So how do we do peer review? Inviting in the peer review. Now in this instance, not blind peer review as you might have for a journal, but that is again challenging the conventions like the conference. When we're setting up our projects, how can we build in peer review? What does peer review mean? And perhaps that you build in that peer review to a performance and include some sort of reflection on that. But it's a very valid point.
Fish would be the wrong one. Actually, sure. This is a comment on it because partly because there's a launch tomorrow night for Kieran Cartman's Select Prose for the World. I'm reading some of the essays this afternoon and reminded yet again of the fact that Kieran's range of interest was extraordinary. So I'm reading an essay of his called What Libraries Are For, which so far has covered the use of mummies as fuel for your projects, the ability to identify books by sniffing them. I did this in a blind experiment. I told my wife to held his books up to my nose. You can identify which ones. But I mean, And I'm just thinking of a sort of really what I'm thinking of here is a kind of sponsoring figure. Because I'm partly thinking of the Hewitt Summer School in its early days, where Hewitt's political activism, his job as an creator of fine arts, his application as a poet, and many different interests were actually used to bring an enormous range of people together. And to have performance, to have all of those sorts of things. And Kieran seems to me even, Hewitt multiplied by 10. And if you have the right sponsoring figure for something, a conference like Kieran Carson would have to have, performers.
Yeah.
Not every performance is an improvisation. No performance.
Yeah.
And the answer to the Portuguese musician is there's no runway.
Exactly. Yeah. Do it. Exactly.
So I just wonder about that kind of sponsoring figure.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, I suppose it is, I guess, a question of infrastructure again, but I mean, I wonder whether we can't predict the future, obviously, but there has been a move in the last, just speaking from UCD particularly, but there has been a move in the last like 5 or 10 years to create these like much more interdisciplinary undergraduate degrees, even almost, so like Emily's degree, creative and cultural industries, I think, so that as those kinds of more interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary or collaborative kinds of agendas become kind of more normalized, I guess, in academia, like even at the undergraduate level, but even at postgraduate level, like we now have the option to do creative PhDs where you have a creative element as part of your, like, you make a film or you write a play or whatever, as part of your PhD. So I think as those kinds of initiatives become more embedded, that perhaps there will be more of an openness, towards that, or at least we'll have to come up with a way to account for those kinds of outputs, right? As they become more common and become more evident. So perhaps that's how we move there, like in inches at a time, I suppose. I don't know.
Yeah, no, and I think again, I feel opening this box, but it's a conversation just beforehand about AI and how we're going to manage that. In a way, this is the kind of stuff that does positively tackle the challenges of AI by engaging in this creative space, by whether it's embodying or being. I mean, as a music student, Kieran Carson, Last Night's Fun was a fundamental text, and yet you go to an English department, Kieran Carson is there. Like somebody like that certainly is a good figure.
Yeah.
But I think another approach is thematic, engaging with an idea and seeing all the different approaches on one idea. So I think there are multiple approaches. I certainly would be very interested in the conference on Kieran Carson myself, but I think there might be other ways of doing it for Irish studies as well.
Well, I will just report to that. It won't be me that organises it. The answer to this question about institutions. I mean, I'm glad to deal with this, but speaking of somebody who's been involved, was employed by the School of English, been involved in Irish studies for most of my career. And we have drama and film, partly because myself and a variety of other colleagues who work over and above what we were actually required to do. And we have creative writing because we had writers in residence who were required only to run one workshop a week. But actually, from the mid-90s on to Morrison, Glenn Patterson, we now have the Seamus Heaney Centre because we have creative writing degrees and all the rest of it. And again, this is people who went above and beyond what they were asked to do. So the sad news about institutions is people are going to just have to do the work. That's all there is to it. I've done my share.
And again, I worry sometimes, have the Seamus Heaney Centre, but has that taken creative writing out of other places and put it in its box? And then I suppose my own experience, Peter, when he introduced me, I'm a lecturer in music, theatre and tourism. And sometimes that's nearly the better way of infiltrating, that if we're all boxed in our own departments, not necessarily by desire or design, I've ended up teaching in the Department of Creative Arts, Media and Music, the Department of Tourism and Hospitality, the Department of Nursing, and the Department of, what we call the Centre of Excellence in Learning and Teaching. But in each of those spaces, I'm bringing in the creativity aspect. So whether it's to do with poetry, culture, so culture into tourism, culture into the caring space in nursing. Sometimes by allowing staff to go beyond the structures of the institution, which is a challenge, but that can be enriching as well. And in some ways, it reflects what Irish Studies is. It's about us going out to feed off the other disciplines, bring what we have. But then I take what I learn in teaching in the nursing department back into my music classroom to teach the music students about that experience. And that's enriching. It's not Irish Studies necessarily, but it is that idea of being able to move beyond an institutional structure.
That's an inspiring point to finish. Thank you very much. Can we, there are copies of the volume there if anyone hasn't had a chance to look at it yet. Don't mind people fingering.
No, no. You're